So in today's video, I want to talk about fertilisation. Now, I know a lot of the people who watch my channel keep dirted tanks or soil substrate, and they're going to say, well, it doesn't really apply to us, does it? Well, actually, I don't really agree with that statement. I believe it's just as important for every type of planted tank. If you've got a planted tank, you're going to need fertilisation eventually in one way, shape or another. I know Dustin's fish tank says dirt don't hurt, and I have the opinion of, well, dirt doesn't hurt. If you don't fert the dirt, it'll go inert. Basically, if you're keeping a planted tank and you're seeing like little pinholes in the leaves, or you're seeing stunted growth, or you're seeing yellow in the leaves, these are signs of a nutrient depletion in your plants. So I like to break fertiliser down into two different types of fertiliser. We've got complete fertilisers, and then we've got stuff that contains mainly micronutrients. So depending how bright you run your light over your planted tank, that's going to adjust the plant's metabolism. Now, the more light you've got, the faster the plant's metabolism, the more CO2 you're going to need to meet that. And then as the plant's metabolism speeds up, it's going to start pulling more nutrients out the water column, out the substrate from wherever it's feeding. And with that, you're going to need an all-in-one fertiliser. Now, when you're using soil as a substrate, you usually get a 6-month pass. So imagine this is a particle of soil, and then inside that you've got this. Now this is the bit that the plants want, this is the plant food, and then the bacteria will come along and break all this structure down, and then they'll release that, and the plants can uptake it. But while it's locked away, the plants can't touch it. Now in soil substrates, that's a common problem. We need the bacteria need oxygen, and we need to make sure this process is working so the bacteria can break these things down and get the nutrients. There's two different types of fertilizer. This is usually for when plants are hungrier, when the metabolism's higher, when the light's higher, and this contains what's called macronutrients, which is nitrogen, which is your nitrogen cycle. Plants will uptake anything from the nitrogen cycle, from ammonia, ammonium, nitrite, nitrate, but they usually work in the opposite direction to how bacteria deal with it. They don't go from bacteria, go ammonia, nitrite, nitrate. Plants have to convert it back and then use the ammonia as ammonium. Then we've got phosphates. They are macronutrients. Now, the way I like to think of these in my head is the proteins, carbs and fats, like the essentials that you need from a meal to sustain yourself. And then you've got your micronutrients, or trace elements as some people call them. And the way I like to think of these are your vitamins out your vegetables, and some people take vitamin supplements, and that's the way I like to see micronutrients. I see them as vegetable vitamins. Now, with a soil substrate, you start off with a reservoir of micronutrients, and then we feed our fish food, and fish food's usually high in proteins, which break down to nitrogen, and then they've got phosphates in them, and then they'll tend to contain the trace elements, the micronutrients, but they can be really inefficient. There's never much potassium in fish food, and soil tends to release it pretty quickly, and then that's exhausted the potassium in the tank. So we need to supplement that, and that's where I argue we need to supplement. Now, Diana Walstad in her book argues to dose powders like potassium and calcium, magnesium, these types of things, to add them to the tank when they're depleted. Now, Diana Walstad wrote a book 25 years ago, and that's before fertilizers like this existed. And I think if I need to add all these things individually, I may as well add a fertilizer that contains potassium and trace elements, and then the fish food can add the nitrogen and the phosphates. So basically, by adding this and this to your fish tank, you're creating this. So my argument is, regardless of whether we're running a low-tech or a high-tech tank, whether we've got an active substrate that's releasing nutrients, or we've got an inert substrate, we need to add supplemental fertilization to keep our plants healthy. Otherwise, plants tend to show signs of deficiency, some in the long term, some in the short term, but eventually most plants tend to start showing nutrient deficiencies unless we're managing the nutrients. And what I tend to do with anything with an active substrate like this Walstad style tank, I'll let it run for a few months and let the nutrients kind of burn themselves out, and then I'll start dosing a low dose of fertilizer and see how I get on. I can raise it and I can reduce it. But then in a tank like this, where I've used a substrate that'll bind all the nutrients, and the plant roots have come along and they'll uptake the nutrients themselves, and then I'll add more nutrients and they'll blind. I tend to fertilise something like this straight away, just mild. There we go, guys. There's a quick look at plant fertilisation. Even in a soil substrate tank, I always argue that we should consider adding potassium and micronutrients. The reason why I add them is because I'm not a believer in waiting for plants to show signs of deficiency before we correct them. I'd rather keep the plants looking nice and healthy rather than waiting for them to look ropey and then correcting that. And some plants will just continue to look ropey once they've shown signs of deficiency, and it's only the new growth that will look healthy. And in slow growing species like heavy root feeders, epiphytes, you can be stuck with plants that look ropey forever after they've shown signs for nutrient deficiency, therefore that's why I like to keep ahead of the curve and fertilise preventatively with nutrients, and then I'll do water changes to pull out the excess. So I hope this has got you thinking. If you run a tank with a soil substrate, I hope it's got you thinking, well, maybe I should be adding nutrients rather than letting it fall into slow managed decay.